All right, we're going to finish up 7.3. Actually, we don't have enough time. There was an example. Actually, two examples. Example 1 and 2. I don't think I'm going to have time to finish that. I'll do that tomorrow. I think I've scheduled on that lesson plan that I was going to finish this lesson tomorrow or something like that. But I'll finish it today, and I'll do that example tomorrow. I think the examples that we're going to go over, I don't think they gave you anything quite that difficult on the homework. I'm not really sure. But I don't, at least for the first part of the homework, because I broke it up into 2 sections, right? So the first part of the homework is nothing that hard, so I don't need to hit that right now. But for the second part, you might need to know it. But I will hit the second part of this lesson. All right, enough of that. Let's talk about this. So we talked about the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagorean theorem basically said this. It says if you have a right triangle, so if you have a right triangle, then what can you say about the sides? You could say what? That a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Okay? So that's if you have a right triangle. Now watch this. If you have any triangle, okay, and let's do this. I'll put a comment there. And if you take the longest side, which we'll call C, all right? So if it's any triangle, if you take the longest side of that triangle and you square it, and then you take the other 2 sides and you square those, and if they're equal to each other, then what kind of triangle do you think you're going to have? A right triangle, okay? You follow me on that? Mm-hmm. So if I take a triangle, I'm not sure if it's a right triangle or not, okay? They just put it on there, and they don't put that little box, right, to tell you it's a right triangle. But they do tell you all 3 sides, right? We should be able to figure out if it's a right triangle or not. So what do? We take the longest side. C is always the longest side out of the 3. Okay, so you take the longest side, you square it. Then you take the other 2 sides, you square them, add those up. And if the longest side squared is equal to the other 2 sides squared added up, right, the sum of the other 2 squares, then it's a right triangle. So if that's true, so if any triangle, if this is true, then what? It's a what? It's a right triangle. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, it's the converse. We've kind of done that stuff before. All right, we switched the if and the then around. And so it shouldn't be, or it should be pretty familiar to you. All right, I'm going to give you another one. I'll tell you what, let's write this down. Let's write it down. So if c squared. Now watch, I start with c squared. I do that for a reason, all right? Because usually we go a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But I'm going to put c squared first on this because of what I'm going to do next. So if c squared equals a squared plus b squared, then it's a what? It's a right triangle. Now here's something else. I think we mentioned this one time earlier in the year, and I don't really expect you to remember it, but I think I did mention it once. Let's say you take a triangle. You don't know anything about it. They don't tell you anything about the angles, okay? They only tell you the sides of the triangle. Everybody with me? So they give you some random triangle. They tell you the 3 sides of the triangle. They want you to figure out, is it a right triangle, first of all? So is there a test to see if it's a right triangle? Yeah, this one right here, okay? So that's the test to see if it's a right triangle. But there's also a test to see if it's an acute triangle or what else? Obtuse triangle. We're going angles, right? Acute, obtuse, okay? So here it is. So if, again, what does the C represent? It represents the longest side, okay? We can only say it's the hypotenuse if we know the triangle is what? A right triangle, okay? So I can't always say that C is the hypotenuse, but we're always going to make C the longest side, okay? So C is always going to be the longest side. So if I take the longest side, square it, and then I do the same thing to the other sides, the other 2 sides, I square them, add them up. If the C squared, let me go in the right order, is less than, okay, now watch this. If C squared, the longest side, if you square it, and that number is less than the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides, then take a wild guess what it might be. It's going to be acute. And you can remember that because an acute angle is what compared to a right angle? It's less than a right angle, okay? You with me on that? So the less than, and that's why I put the C first, because the less than and the acute kind of makes sense. Would you agree with that? So if it's less than 90 degrees, it's an acute angle. So if c squared is less than a squared plus b squared, then it's an acute what? Triangle. Okay? So what they're going to do is they're going to give you a triangle with 3 lengths. And they're going to ask you, first of all, is it a right triangle? Is it an acute triangle? Or is it an obtuse triangle? And then you just have to do that little test. And it's pretty simple. All right? So what do you think the next one's going to be? If c squared is equal to a squared plus b squared, then it's right. If c squared is less than a squared plus b squared, then it's acute. That's right, greater than. If c squared is greater than a squared plus b squared, then it would be an obtuse triangle. Okay? Everybody with me on that? It's pretty simple, isn't it? Sure. Let's do an example. Now, we're skipping to example 3 because we didn't do 1 and 2. All right, so I'll just keep that stuff up there, try to fit it all in here. So this is what they're going to do. They're not even going to draw the triangle for you. All right, so you can't just look at it and say, well, it sure looks obtuse or it sure looks acute. Okay, we're not going to do that. They're actually just going to give you the numbers for the triangle. So they're going to say this triangle has sides 7, 12, and 13. Let's backtrack a little bit before we actually do this and figure out what kind of triangle this is. First of all, do you remember there was like a little test to see if it's a triangle to begin with?
Yeah.
Remember that? So what do we do to decide even if this is a triangle? You had this on a quiz and a test before. So how do I know that this is even a triangle? Not right, acute, or obtuse, just that it's a triangle. There's a little test that we did. It's a very simple test. What is it, Hannah?
You add the 2 squares up, but it has to be bigger.
The third side, right. Yep, the biggest one, right? Yeah, exactly right. She said it exactly right. Okay, so if you add these 2 up, 7 plus 12 is what? 19. Is 19 bigger than 13? Yeah, so is it a triangle to begin with? Yes, it is. It's definitely a triangle. So now, let's figure out if it's right, acute, or obtuse. Okay, so what are we going to do? Okay, so we use C. Which one is the C here?
13.
How do you know it's the C? It's the biggest. The biggest is always the C. So I take 13 squared. I'm going to put a little question mark here because I don't know just right now if it's equal, less than, or greater than. Okay, so I'll put a little question mark. And now let's take the other 2 sides. Doesn't matter what order you do them in. But let's take the other 2 sides. We'll square those, and then we're going to add them up. Okay, so 13 squared, I think I know that. That's 169. This is what? 49, and this is 144. So what is that? That's 13, 14, 193. 193. So compare 169 to 193. 169 is what? Less than 193. So if it's less than, then this is an acute triangle. And that's your answer right there. Okay, but this is the work to show how we got the answer. Now look, you got a 33.33% chance to get the problem right if you just guessed, right? But is that good odds? Is 1/3 of a chance? No. Okay. 100% chance is pretty good odds, right? So be able to do the problem, figure it out, and then that's how we do it. What do you think? Yeah. So yesterday I said to do. I'll write it down again. I gave you a lesson plan thing today. We're going to call it A because we will have a part B tomorrow. Okay. But this is still part A. I'm not giving you new problems to do. I'll just write it down just so you remember. 314, 315, and then 1 through 10. That's supposed to be a number symbol, hashtag, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, it's on the lesson plans. It's right there. Okay, so it's 1 to 10 and 13 to 19. Now, 1 to 10, you would have been able to do before we did this stuff. The 13 and 19 is this stuff right here. So some of you might have already done 1 through 10, right? Because I told you about it yesterday. But if you didn't, it's fine. You can still do it tonight. Turn it in tomorrow. So this is officially due tomorrow, all right? And then I'll give you part B. And we're going to do that example 1 and 2 that I skipped yesterday, okay? Everybody good? All right. Stay in your seats until the bell rings.